Morning. My name is Sheila Lamb, and I'm with the Virginia SBDC Network. For those of you that are not familiar with our organization, the Virginia Small Business Development Center is a partnership program between the U.S. Small Business Administration, George Mason University, and local host institutions throughout Virginia. With 26 locations across the Commonwealth, we provide training and technical assistance to small businesses in their local communities. Our one-on-one advising services are available at no charge. Today's webinar, Craft Compliance, Non-Traditional Production, is presented by the Virginia SBDC Network. We are recording today's presentation and it will be posted on our website, virginiasbdc.org. Due to the large number of participants, everyone's microphone is muted and the chat feature is turned off. But if you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the Q&A box. We have also enabled the live transcript function, which you can show or hide via your own meeting controls. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Virginia SBDC Craft Beverage Assistance Program Manager, Chris Van Orden.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this conversation about the regulatory environment for non-traditional production models in the alcohol sector. My name is Chris Van Orden, and I'm the manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance Program at the Virginia Small Business Development Center at George Mason University. The CBA program is designed to provide industry-specific guidance to Virginia's craft beverage sector. So, as always, today's program is going to be a free-flowing discussion on the variety of arrangements and models available to producers today and what steps need to be taken to ensure compliance. If you have any questions, feel free to raise them using the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer any and all of them either during or after the webinar. So I'm excited to welcome back Kevin Anderson, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at alcoholconsulting.com and Executive Director of the Loudoun County Brewers Association. As a former Virginia Alcohol Beverage Control Authority Special Agent, Kevin spent years on the lookout for regulatory violations, but today he works with alcohol producers around Virginia and across the country on developing thoughtful compliance strategies. So again, today I'll be asking Kevin to give us a rundown on the issues that founders need to be aware of when they're kind of not fitting into a clear category here, and really appreciate his expertise. Kevin, welcome.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for having me again. It's always fun doing these. I think this is maybe my fourth or fifth one. These are always exciting, and we have great questions too. So
I feel like I could have you here every week, but I respect that you have probably other things to do as well. So yeah, we're going to be talking about things that aren't always fitting the traditional model of regulations here, just the things that are a little hard to categorize and kind of how regulators think about them. So before we get into all of these exceptions and caveats here, can you give us just a top level overview of how regulations around alcohol production are traditionally organized?
yeah, happy to do that. So, I mean, when you're trying to start, whether it's a winery, brewery, distillery, two or three of those, you're looking at three types of distinct alcoholic beverages. So you have wine and hard cider, which are usually lumped together, made with grapes, pears, or apples. You have beer or also malt beverages, which are produced by breweries, and you have distilled spirits, which are produced and packaged by distilleries. So these are all very different, and they have different licenses, different compliance strategies, requirements, and things you can and cannot do on site. These are also not only regulated in those three categories, but at different levels. So now you have TTB, you have federal regulations that completely control each of those categories. You have Virginia ABC regulations that are different, which control them at the state level. And then if you ever want to sell your product out of Virginia, every state has their own rules and regulations concerning wine, beer, spirits, and cider. I know one or two states even consider hard cider beer, and even though most states don't and the feds don't. So there's a lot of caveats and nuances to everything we're talking about today. But that's kind of the main alcohol regulations. FDA does come into play in many cases as well, where you might have to add certain things such as nutritional facts labeling, and also the way you advertise. So, advertisements might not just be alcohol related for, ABC, but, other federal agencies can get involved, such as the Federal Communications Commission, about the way you're advertising things. So, you have wine, beer, spirits at, different levels of federal, state, even some localities in the US regulate. But luckily, Virginia's localities don't really regulate it to the way ABC does. So.
Yeah, gosh, yeah, that's a great point. That's like, that's its own conversation, just right, making sure that you're managing the different levels of regulators properly. And I think it's sometimes people think about regulations in terms of just getting the doors open, getting licensed, that kind of thing. But things like advertising, like I know that there's rules about, well, can you give a neon to a retailer? Well, that depends where and what kind of product you're talking about. So, right, really important
Yeah,
to get that right, um, and knowing where you fit into those regulations. But that's, it's a little bit easier if you are a brewery and all you make is beer, or if you're a distillery and all you make is spirits, you know which retailers you can sell to, right? In Virginia, ABC for spirits only, that kind of thing.
yeah.
But nowadays, we're seeing a lot of producers kind of breaking the mold or not fitting neatly into one of those three buckets. What are some of the, you know, non-traditional models that you're starting to encounter, or maybe that you've worked with? Are there any kind of um, trends that you're seeing about these hybrid?
Yeah. So, we're seeing, especially as prices for land and rent and leases are on the rise, we're seeing different producers. So different companies, a winery and a brewery, or two different breweries kind of come together and try to share a similar space. So maybe they have a building that they're leasing together. And in one part of the building is one brewery, the other part is another brewery, and they're able, they can't share physical drinking space, they can't share equipment, but they're sharing a lot of the overhead of the issues that come with leasing space. We're also seeing where a wholesaler will also lease a space in the same physical building as a brewery, and that happens to also be the wholesaler that's wholesaling that brewery's beer. They're completely separate companies, they're separate ownerships, they have separate leases, but it just the way of sharing space we're seeing a lot. And those would be two different companies kind of coming together and kind of being on one property or under one roof. But another thing that we're seeing also is beer brands. So brand ownership. To be a brand owner, you don't have to be a winery for a wine brand. You don't have to be a brewery to own your own beer brand. Virginia allows a beer wholesaler to own their own beer brand. So you could
Mhm.
call yourself, 123 ABC Brewing Company, but actually be licensed as a wholesaler and have your product contract produced by a brewery. And then essentially you're wholesaling your own brand of beer, which is allowable. And that's one thing that we're seeing a lot of people doing that at all the different levels. So a beer, wine wholesalers wholesaling their brand of wine while they're having it produced elsewhere, and even spirit, wholesalers. So you get your distilled spirit or your wholesaler's license at the federal level, and you can then enter into the agreements in certain places and states and have your own distilled spirits brand, whether it is a actual bottle of distilled spirits, such as like a bourbon or a vodka, or even the RTD cocktails. The ready to drink cocktails where you have vodka sodas and things of that nature. So we're seeing everyone's trying to do new things because the industry has been getting crowded, and especially distribution is getting a little tougher. So there's a lot of new things that people are doing, which we'll talk about more of this throughout today's talk. But it's exciting though what's happening, and one of the non-traditional models that's really going is agritourism. So
Mhm.
we're seeing a huge boom in the farm operations when it comes to having a limited brewery or farm brewery that you might think of, having a farm winery, having a farm or limited distillery. Basically, you're out on agriculturally zoned land, usually, but not always a farm, where you have a lot of outdoor space and land, and you're offering multiple things. So, they have a winery and brewery on site. It might be a restaurant. They have food trucks there. You have space to bring families, pets, and then enjoy the entire day because they have everything all in one location. So you're seeing these traditional wineries that were very wine specific adding brewery licenses. People that you never would have thought who would ever have added a brewery license to their winery are now doing it because they see that these non-traditional models are what the consumers are really looking for. And also the non-alcoholic beer boom. So every
Mhm.
type of alcohol, whether it's wine, beer, spirits, has a non-alcoholic version, but it's the non-alcoholic beer which is really taken off. And we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, that's a lot. There's a lot to dig into there.
Yeah,
Yeah, so maybe we can start off with, like what you mentioned, right? Whether it's on agriculturally zoned land or otherwise, you're seeing a lot of producers diversifying their product offerings across categories, right? So it's not, hey, you come to the winery and you drink wine. Hey, we have, estate grown wines, but we also have beer made on site. Obviously, you have to be careful about how you're doing your licensing, but sharing, facilities, well, what does that look like? Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, in Virginia for producers that are, you know, offering more than one product, and right, where, how far they can push things, and if there's
yeah.
any major differences when you're saying, let's say beer and wine versus beer and spirits.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Producers are looking now to not just offer, but even produce their own additional products. So let's say you have a traditional brewery that wants to now add a winery. They could be in a commercial area, in a warehouse. They could be on a farm, but they're wanting to add a winery to their business, and that's where Virginia, requires you to have separate spaces. So you do have to have separate space that is just for your brewing area, separate space just for your wine production area. But you can have some common equipment, which we'll get into a little bit later, where you can use some of the same equipment. But licensing is all different. So you need to add a new license. So you have to apply to a new federal license. You're gonna have to apply for a brand new Virginia ABC license, and that also then applying for your ABC license, doing that addition, adding a winery to a brewery, you're now open to a 30-day objection period again from your community. So if you happen to, get through the objection period with no issues, and a couple years later you're looking to open something new, that opens that objection period up for that new application. So your original application is still there, it's good, no one can touch it, but your new winery application has the ability for objectors to come forward if you've had issues in the past, and people can, kind of show maybe there's been a problem, that could put a hiccup in the addition, because you have federal licensing, you have state licensing, you have separated areas that you're going to have in your building. But a lot of people are doing this. I'm seeing these on farms, I'm seeing these in warehouses, I'm even seeing these in commercial spaces like strip malls. You have a brewery that's adding a small commercial winery inside their commercial brewery space because they're trying to diversify what they're offering. But that then brings in more reporting. So now you have more TTB reports, more federal reports, more labels and formulas and colas. So that it brings a lot of these additional requirements, but it also adds privileges. So you can share your drinking area. So if you have a winery and brewery on the same property, it's the same ownership, you can have a shared tasting room where wine and beer can be shared together. If you want to add a distillery, you can do that. It's another level because Virginia regulates distilled spirits at the state level. It's controlled. Every distillery also has to be a distillery store, which has a separate space. And they have to have a separated tasting. I should say they should have a separated tasting room.
Mm-hmm.
It's not required, but if you have a shared tasting room with your on-site distillery, you can only offer samples of your wine and beer. You can't do pints and pitchers. So that's why almost every business I've seen in Virginia, there's one or two that have a common tasting room. But if you want to sell, pints of beer and glasses of wine, I would have your distilled spirit tasting room completely separated, because the distilled spirits, you can only have a tasting. You have one tasting a day, and that's it. Then you can go over to the wine, beer, restaurant area and partake with, whatever else they have. So, adding distilled spirits can be more complicated, but some businesses I know have added a distillery, but don't actually distill their own product. They're actually buying bulk spirits and making RTD cocktails. So they're ready to drink cocktails in-house, where they might be a 7.5%, vodka soda.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's happening is they are a distillery that's producing it. But in Virginia, these low alcohol beverage coolers, which are, vodka sodas, bourbon cokes in a can, as long as they're under 7.5% alcohol, they're actually sold as wine in Virginia. So that's why you see those in your grocery stores, and even some of your wineries sell them, because they're considered wine as long as they're under 7.5%. So some of these businesses are adding distilleries which are producing these spirits essentially so they can sell them under their on-site winery license. So
Mm.
essentially, they're having these homemade distilled spirit cocktail drinks that they can sell them out of their tasting room, either because they're a licensed restaurant or because they have an on-site winery and they've been able to transfer product. So there's little nuances and ways to do things. It's just making sure it's done correctly from the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good insight for people, right? Anybody who's working in a distillery or hopes to open one needs to know about those rules about tasting, but knowing that these 7.5 and below cocktails get regulated as wine, hey, that opens doors for people. And you also
Mhm.
mentioned, the option to have the on-site restaurant, which itself could have its own licensing to serve beverages of a different sort, but right, making sure there's this sort of multiple tier question that arises too, which
Yeah.
we can talk about in a little bit here as well. You mentioned people operating both a producer category of some sort as well as a wholesaler, but that kind of like leads me to another question in a similar or potential arrangement. Companies that are partnering with contract producers to make some or all of their product for them. So these contract agreements, rotating proprietorships, you said buying bulk spirits that somebody blends. What are the options that are available to companies now, and what regulations do both the sort of contract producer and the contracting company need to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, that's big business. A lot of breweries who first open up in Virginia, a lot of distilleries who first open up, a lot of their product is not always produced by them because it takes sometimes months to produce product. How does a brand new distillery serve bourbon? Have 5-year-old age bourbon? It's not possible. They're sourcing it when they open because it takes so long in many cases to really get product, and they're doing it, usually by one or two different ways. So usually a brewery in Virginia can contract brew. So you can brew for another brewery and they can brew something for you. So brewery A can ask brewery B in Virginia, hey, we would like, can you contract brew for us? And all they have to do is enter into what ABC has as a contract brewing agreement. And it's in the code. You can just type in contract brewing agreement. It's a very simple thing that you can have. It just states like who's doing what, the amount of beer being brewed, what's being brewed. Your contract brewing agreements can be paragraph sentences long, or they can be 100 pages. It's up to you, your attorneys, and how complicated these things can be. But it allows a brewery to brew beer for another brewery. Manufacturers, but wholesalers can also do that. So a beer wholesaler in Virginia can also enter into a contract brewing agreement with a brewery, and that brewery can brew beer for them, brew beer or malt beverages. And now that wholesaler can go out and sell to retailers their own brand, which we just discussed. A few years ago, Virginia did pass a law which requires breweries to produce 20% of the beer that they sell through their tasting room on site. So if brewery A has a small brewery in Richmond and they really don't want to brew beer from scratch on site. They just don't have the space, but they want to be a community room. They want to be able to offer what they can. Under TTB, that's fully allowable. Virginia ABC says they have to produce 20%. So if you sell 100 barrels of beer out of your tasting room, 20 of those barrels should have been produced on site at your brewery and not contract produced. Then ABC came out with what's called a guidance document. So if you go to the Virginia Town Hall website and type in like ABC guidance documents, Virginia ABC further describes what production means. And a brewery does not actually have to produce or ferment their beer from scratch. They can package beer differently. So repackaging beer into different kegs, aging it on site, then packaging it into kegs, that's considered production under ABC. So everything is really of how it's being done. So definitely talk with somebody before you go that route. But it's not necessarily, you don't actually physically have to produce from scratch like most people would think they have to.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's lucky for some of the breweries. But farm wineries, commercial wineries, depending on the license type, because Virginia has 5 types of winery licenses, 4 farm winery license types now, and a commercial license. They all have different requirements, but also privileges. So there's minimum requirements for how many acreage you might need, how many grapes and or apples or pears are coming from your property on site. in your product. So it could be 50% or 51% of the product you produce have to come from your land, and you can buy other product from somewhere else. So there's a lot more caveats with wineries, but they can still do the same thing. They can contract manufacture, they can purchase wine from someone else. They also do custom crush where, you give your grapes to another winery, they crush it, they bottle it and send it back to you. That's very common. It's been being done for years and years and years in the wine industry. And distilleries can do similar things. Under TTB, you can ship bulk spirits under transfer and bond very simply. And even bottled spirits can be transferred in some circumstances. So from one distillery to another in bond. So these are all things that can be done through kind of contract agreements and sending product back and forth, not necessarily produced 100% at your business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so,
that's interesting. There's a lot of things that are happening here. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and and one thing to note though is the taxes can be very different. So excise tax at the federal level can change dramatically based on the fact that a distillery produced the product themselves, or did they just buy it in bulk and bottle it. The tax can be huge. So just talking through beer real quick, the tax range for a federal excise tax for a barrel of beer, generally for a small producer, is $3.50 a barrel, but that can go all the way up to $18 a barrel. And one of those interesting things are, if a brewery accepts beer in bond from another brewery and doesn't produce it and do anything else to it, you don't qualify for the low tax rate. So if you bring in beer in bond from another brewery, you're going to be paying significantly higher federal tax. And a lot of people don't realize that, which can get caught up in audits. The same thing happens for distilleries. So, a distillery might be able to have a tax rate of $2.70 per proof gallon. So a proof gallon is a gallon of distilled spirits at 50% alcohol by volume at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you think of, a gallon of vodka at 50% alcohol, the federal tax rate, maybe for a small producer, they paid $2.70 for that 1 gallon in your hand. But if they bought bulk vodka from another distillery, and all they did was just put it in their own bottles and resell it, they don't qualify for that reduced tax rate. They are going to pay possibly the full tax rate on that, which could be $13.50 per proof gallon. So you're looking at 4 or 5 times the excise tax, depending on, did you produce it? If you didn't, depending on the commodity, did you do something else to it? Did you process it, add something to it? Did you filter it? These are all things that can come up, which can greatly affect your tax rate. And we talked about alternation of proprietorships, and alternation of premises is something else that we've discussed about the kind of way of doing contracts in some forms and fashion. So an alternation of premise is a TTB, is a federal term that allows one entity, so your LLC or corporation, to have, say, a winery, a brewery, a distillery, all under one roof, sharing similar space, sharing equipment. So that allows you to essentially share your wine premise with your beer premise, with your distilled spirit premise, and it's all under one owner. That is somewhat, as we said, allowed in Virginia. TTB allows it. Virginia somewhat allows it, but there's some caveats on the equipment. Some of it has to be just for brewery, some of it has to be just for winery, distillery, with some common area as well. So that is possible. TTB also allows what's called an alternation of proprietorship. That's where you have, say, one brewery and you have 10 different breweries all using the same and licensed at the same space. Virginia does not recognize that. So Virginia does not allow the idea of the alternation of proprietorship. So when you have different companies, different LLCs, different corporations using the same equipment in the same space, Virginia does not allow that. So that is allowed in other states. Pennsylvania allows it. California allows it. There's a bunch of other states that allow the alternation of proprietorships, which is a great thing, because you can have one winery in California have 100 different winery licenses at the federal and state level issued to that space. And they might just have a teeny little cage that is their licensed space. And then when it's their turn to use the wine equipment, then the wine's produced under their license during that time, then they pay the taxes, they do their labels and formulas as they need. But that can't be done in Virginia as of yet.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. It's good to know what you can and certainly what you can't do. And I just want to circle back around to the point you made about, right, bringing in finished product from other producers and just how important it is to make sure you know, right, are you doing some value add process to it where you get the ability to say it's your own product? Because that, I know that people are always looking for innovative models where they might be reducing
Yeah,
their overhead, but that adds up very quick if you're quadrupling your tax burden, right? Just by not having some value add process along the way. And it's interesting to hear how, right, it doesn't have to be full on production, but something beyond just packaging, right? There's
yeah,
refractory companies that might be aging something in that neutral grain spirit, to it could be anything from just something simple like chili peppers, or they might be making a full on marrow, whatever it might be. But that transformation process could reduce the tax burden significantly, but they might not need to stand up their own still and all of that. Is that something that you
exactly.
think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of new distilleries. To get a distillery license at the federal level, there's three essentially license types. You have production, you have processing, and storage. So most full distilleries have all three license types, where they have production, means they have a still and they can produce from scratch. They process, that's another license type, which then allows them to mix, to do other things to the products as well, and also a storage, which allows them to store bulk spirits over the size of a gallon container. There are a lot of distilleries that are foregoing the production part of their federal license, meaning they don't have a still on site because they're not actually producing their own distilled spirits from scratch. They have the processing part of their license and the storage part. The storage part allows them to then store those totes and those barrels of spirits as they come in. And then the processing part allows them to mix and mingle the spirits, age, and then bottle or package. So they're buying bulk spirits from elsewhere and then they're making it their own. They're adding things to it, they're filtering, they're aging longer.
Mhm.
Or they could be buying young bourbon and
Yeah.
then just transferring those barrels from Kentucky or wherever they purchased them from now to their own rick house. And they're aging them for 1, 2, 4, 5, 10 years in themselves. So they didn't produce it, but now they're storing it and then going to process it before they bottle.
Yeah. Well, knowing that that's an option might be interesting to people who are setting up their businesses. Of course, there's also the marketing aspect of all this, making it, people like seeing production, if, being able to tell that story about, hey, we are adding value here, even if we're not the ones distilling this product or the ones, I mean, I know there's a lot of sour beer companies that are, blending. They might be contracting out their work to another party or bringing that in-house and blending themselves. Certainly like, negociant style winemaking being another one where, hey, we have other people, we have growing partners. If you say custom crush, we are here to do this, but it's really important to know what the appropriate license is, what the implications are for tax burden and other things like that,
Yeah.
what you can do in terms of sales, and then how is the market going to respond? Are people, for better or for worse, like to feel like they're patronizing companies that actually made the product? And, if you're doing mostly just kind of branding, there's nothing wrong with that, but just knowing how to um, present that to customers in a way that seems authentic and genuine and like you're really there
Yeah.
doing something.
Yep.
So we'll come back a little bit to something about that and a little bit later when we talk about some of the kind of evolving licensing in Virginia. But I wanted to touch on another growth area that we're seeing, which is the non-alcoholic space, NA products,
Yep.
right? These are on the rise, and you mentioned NA beer. How have you kind of seen producers introduce NA product lines in a way that kind of fits in with their overall model and is, compliant, right? We're talking about
Yeah.
even just the technologies for doing this. There's more than one way to arrive at an NA product.
Yeah. I mean, NA beer is really taking off. Most breweries in Virginia that I've been to recently are offering, but it's not the easiest to produce. Producing non-alcoholic beer usually is done one of two ways. You're using a yeast strain that is low alcohol, and you're doing things like stopping the fermentation and keeping it below the 0.5 or the 0.5% non-alcohol threshold the whole time. Then there's other ways where, they're brewing a product that gets above the alcohol threshold of 0.5 or 0.5%. And then they're doing things to it to then bring it back down. And it's not easy. I've heard from a lot of Virginia breweries trying to produce their own NA beer, and they're like, oh man, our first one was at 1.5%. Well, that's now just a really low alcoholic product. It's a beer. You can call it actually low alcohol. That is a term that can be used. I believe it's under 2.5% alcohol. You can use low alcohol, but it's no longer no alcohol. So, I've seen just a lot of breweries start buying the national brands and selling them. They're buying Athletic, they're buying Go Brewing, and a few others who've, kind of found their niche because they found, I guess, a way to do it right. And for some of these breweries, it beats reinventing the wheel. But when it comes to these NA beverages or NA beers per se, there's two distinct types. You have the first one, that's called a non-alcoholic beer or NA beer. These products are below 0.5% or 0.5% of alcohol by volume, but they're more than 0%. The second type is 0% alcohol or no alcohol beer. That is seriously where it's 0.0%. And I think there's a Heineken out there that says that in bold letters, 0.0%, that it is zero alcohol, which is kind of weird that non-alcoholic has alcohol in it, but 0% beer has 0% alcohol. And what's even weirder is not to produce this product, you don't always have to be licensed brewery. You can produce NA beer, so non-alcoholic beer and 0% alcohol beer outside of a licensed brewery. But the main key to doing so is the product can never go above 0.5% alcohol by volume. As soon as it hits 0.5% alcohol by volume, it is now considered an alcoholic beverage, and that's where you have to be licensed. And that's probably the reason why almost everyone producing this is doing it so at a licensed brewery. Because if it ever during the process, it's not just the finished product, it's during production. If it ever goes above, that's where you now have to be licensed. And then there's other things. You have so like NA beer, so up to just or below 0.5% and above 0.5 or above 0%. You might also have a formula that has to be submitted depending on your production and if you've added anything else into it. And if it's brewed at a brewery and you're trying to sell that across state lines, that's where that federal COLA is still required because it's produced at a licensed brewery. However, if it's produced at an unlicensed location that's fully qualified, they don't have those same requirements. So it is kind of a weird industry where if you're licensed, you have other compliance factors that go into play than whether you don't have a license. So other regulations are non-alcohol, or 0% alcohol. So 0.0% alcohol beer also always have to have a formula, and a sample has to be submitted to the TTB lab in Maryland, because TTB is they want to make sure that the beer that you say is 0.0% actually truly is 0.0%. So before you can sell that and stuff, you're gonna have to send a sample off to the federal lab for them to test it first. And there's also other regulations, even labeling regulations come into play. So for non-alcoholic beer, they have to add certain verbiage, which is one of them is that the product is non-taxable under section 5051 of the IRC, which is the Internal Revenue Code, which is saying this is a non-alcoholic product not subject to excise tax. Also, these non-alcoholic beers cannot use those same terms that an alcoholic beer malt beverage can. So an NA beer cannot have the word ale on the label. You can't use the word lager on the label. You can't use the word stout on the label. You can't say that you have a India Pale Ale as your non-alcoholic beer, because those are class definitions of alcoholic products, which must be 0.5% alcohol or greater. So the term malt beverage, the term beer, you can also use the term cereal beverage. And there's a few other terms you can use. You can actually put IPA on there because the initials or the letters IPA are not an actual class designation. So you can say IPA. The key is you can't use that word ale on a non-alcoholic beer. So this is such it's not a gray area, but it's very, very difficult for a lot of these businesses to figure out the regulations, because even nationally, and we've been actually doing these a lot for a lot of new clients, where they want to know what the regulations are going state to state. So what, if you're now trying to produce an NA beer and you want to sell it in different states, I think there's 8 states where you have to be 21 for NA beer. There's 2 states where you have to be 18 or over for NA beer. Some states don't allow direct shipping of NA beer, I think 5 or 6 states. So there's a whole nother regulatory scheme of the NA malt beverage beer section than there is to the alcoholic beer section of things.
Yeah, gosh, that's fascinating. It's a whole separate world to navigate. I feel like a lot of, producers that may already be selling across state lines, they think that they've got it. Well, this is a whole different ball game to enter here. So it's important to get it right. And yes, I know, like, it's really interesting to hear the difference between 0.0 and that 0.5. I mean, I know there's like the non-alcoholic space, right? Kombucha being a product that probably has a similar thing, that below that 0.5, right? If you make kombucha, you can make that non-alcoholic beer. But it's interesting to hear that licensed breweries have additional obligations if they're making the same product, right? Who makes the product is as important as the product itself in some instances. So
I enjoy talking also about kombucha. It's one of those other little gray areas, because the idea of kombucha can be, depending on the formulation, it's either considered a wine or a beer. So those are all the factors to consider when trying to create new things, out of the box thinking. Kombucha is still getting big. Breweries are producing it in Virginia. Wineries are producing it. Really, it depends on how it's fermented. Kombucha at a brewery is generally brewed and its alcohols derived from sugar, then added juices. Wines kombucha is where the juices are the ones that are fermenting to get the alcohol. So it depends on your process, whether you're going to be a winery or a brewery at both the state and federal level. Another thing is to think of kombucha has a problem of increasing in alcohol content after it's packaged. So if you're leaving a bottle of kombucha, of alcoholic or even non-alcoholic kombucha, in like a hot van for like a day or two, and now the alcohol content has changed or has gotten over the 0.5% threshold and now become an alcoholic product, it's actually on the producer. It's not on, you can't say, hey, Mr. Consumer, you can't leave our drink out in the sun. That you can't do that. It's not, it's not up to the consumer. It's the producer that would get in trouble if that product has an issue or the alcohol content's different than what it may state on the label.
Yeah. Bottle re-fermentation, right? It's something to be managed by everybody. I know in some categories you make sure that there isn't any, but there are plenty of beer styles where that is intentional, right? You're allowing some of the mild fermentation to help with carbonation, right? It allows a little bit of age, but yeah, if you're in a category where there's a cap, you need to really make sure. And that goes for, alcohol tolerance levels, right? I know North Carolina has a tighter range of allowability in terms of, you say it's 5.5%. You don't have, right, 5.2 to 5.8. You have a much tighter band, and hey, things do re-ferment. So that's fascinating. But that does kind of raise the question of just, there's more and more products in these categories of functional beverages, things that are in that space that may have some, some of them are brand new categories. Some of them are brought in from other cultures. Kvass, kombucha, all of these beverages that may have alcohol, may not, but don't fit neatly into those categories. What are some of the things that you're seeing developing in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the term functional alcoholic beverages is kind of like an oxymoron when it comes to regulation. It's booming. That's what you see. People are creating that. We're getting inundated with people wanting to create functional alcoholic beverages, and they're, looking for ways that they can do it. From getting licensed to marketing strategies and things like that. Functional alcoholic beverages is such a gray area. You can add vitamins and minerals, antioxidants, and other types of ingredients to your alcoholic beverages as long as you get your TTB formulas approved. The biggest problem with these products comes in when it comes to advertising. So advertising in social media, on your website, or any form of media for that matter, you just cannot advertise alcohol as healthy You can't make any connotation that it is healthy. You can't make any statements that might be misleading. And that's why most of these companies where you see them have a functional alcoholic beverage brand is their labeling doesn't say anything about what they're not supposed to say, but they are saying things on social media and on their website, which would be a violation because, they're getting through that COLA process and they're getting their label approved where you're not saying, oh, we have vitamin A, B, C, D, we have these minerals, we have antioxidants. They're not putting that in their labels, but they're putting that elsewhere. And those are still violations. TTB, when their TTB investigators come out and do an on-site, they go through your social media page. Because I've been through these now a couple times in the past month. The first thing they do, I think before they even arrive, is they look at all your social media channels. They go to your website. They see what is going on, and they're looking at your advertising, seeing what's happening with your business and the products that you're producing. TTB requires the statements on their labels that, because they have a COLA approval process or label approval process, that these statements cannot be false. They cannot mislead the consumer. That includes, I think, claims about nutritional content, unless they are factual and can be backed up by science and other things. Labels and advertisements can't show that there's some type of curative or therapeutic effect. They can't imply those effects or imply health benefits. And it's not just beer, it's all alcoholic beverages and even non-alcoholic malt beverages. So NA beers that are considered malt beverages, we're not going to get into that big conversation, but beer and malt beverages are not the exact same thing. Every malt beverage is a beer, but not every beer is a malt beverage. Kind of like how every bourbon's a whiskey, but not every whiskey is a bourbon. And there's different regulations surrounding what you can and cannot say when it comes to beers and malt beverages. But health-related statements, you can't say that improves health, promotes healthy digestion, no hangover, makes you feel great in the morning. Those are all things that will probably be flagged in the COLA process and denied. And even nutritional analysis. So some products do require a FDA nutritional panel to be on the label. Not all of them, not all alcoholic beverages require this, but that's where having either hiring an attorney, hiring someone, or knowing what the rules and regulations are when those nutritional fact labels need to be on there. And a lot of people want to put the word antioxidant or vitamin C on their labeling, but you can't also pick and choose what ingredients you tell people about. You would have to then pick and choose all of them and put them all in the same font, the same style, the same size. So you're not picking and choosing that these ingredients are more important than these ingredients. So, and a lot of it's testing, throw a label in, submit it for a COLA and see what TTB says, see how many corrections they come back with.
Yeah. Gosh, it's, and I think it's really good insight for people to keep in mind, right? You do all the work to make sure you're compliant when it comes to, getting your label approved. You think that that's it, the race is run. Well, make sure that your social media team knows, hey, we can't be going out just saying whatever we want now. Like, and it doesn't have to be much, right? Doesn't have to say, oh, this is gonna, cure blindness. We're not talking something that far along, but just saying, hey, right, like, if you have an IPA that has orange peel in it, you might say packed with vitamin C, even jokingly. Well, that's a claim, and you need to make sure that you're keeping close tabs on what people are saying. So, yeah, that is very good. And I don't know how many producers, but it sounds like you're just seeing a lot of this come up.
It's across the country. You have two separate, distinct types of businesses. You have people that want to be hyper local. They want to be that destination. Or you have someone that usually then wants to go straight into distribution. They don't really have a footprint, in any specific city. They don't have a physical tasting room, but they're trying to go out to distribution and in every state they can. And, they want to get out there and they already have their labels. Their team created their labels even before they even created a business. And the labels are just completely a mess with everything that shouldn't be on there. And it's a learning experience for a lot of people of, how complicated things can be, but when it's done correctly, it can be very lucrative. So
yeah, it's an interesting space to be out there at the frontier. So,
and you can see, Buzz Balls, they just got bought out recently, what, for a couple $100 million. So it can be lucrative.
Yeah, gosh, yeah. Just thinking about how long they've been around, really, a rarefied company. Like there were not many people in those prepackaged cocktail spaces, right? They set the stage for a lot of people. Um, and that's, yeah, it's interesting to hear more and more people going in that direction. But thinking about, right, companies that are operating at the vanguard, are there any other kinds of models or things that you're seeing pop up that either regulators are trying to catch up with or really require people to thread the needle to make sure that they're setting themselves up for success? And that might be, either filling out regulations or, compliance, getting that built right, or even just basing their model or building their model to fit regulations. Like you said, right? If you're only going to be making non-alcoholic beer, well, licensing yourself as a brewery may actually force you to have more obligations. So are they anything like that?
So I'm not really seeing the gray area as much. I mean, over the last decade, hemp and stuff has been trying to be added. I
Mhm.
think a lot of that has gotten away from the alcohol industry because they don't come together. Hemp, cannabis, and alcohol, they can't be legally put in the same product under TTB. So that's why a lot of businesses are going the complete non-alcohol route. It has
Mhm.
nothing to do with the alcohol industry. I'm not seeing as much of the gray area, someone pushing an envelope, as much as we are just seeing that the innovation that they're seeing what everyone else is doing. They're trying to mimic each other. They're offering as much as they can to get their clients and patrons to be there. Like really, the biggest thing I'm seeing is those destinations
Mm.
where not only are they having something for everybody, but I've heard rumblings that there are some or one or two in Virginia that might be offering trout fishing on site, hiking and biking trails on their farm brewery or limited brewery. So it's more of a lifestyle, and that's where the issue can come with functional beverages of how you advertise it. Or is the lifestyle that you have is, hey, look, we're a winery, brewery, distillery, but you can spend a day here. We have fishing, we have this, we have food, we have a great place for people to just spend their day. And that's really the pushing is on the forefront I see on agritourism. It's
Yeah.
where the farms and the communities and the population are kind of meeting. That's where a lot of this local regulatory issues are coming up, and where business are more pushing the envelope of what they can do on their property versus a specific type of beverage or a new innovative technique.
Yeah, that's interesting. So they're more about blending models than they are about the actual product innovation space, right? It's just saying, well,
A
what are
little,
you? Yes,
yeah.
we're a brewery, but we're also a hotel or inn, and we're a restaurant, and we're, like you said, trout fishing
and
destination.
and a lot of these places are good. They're community hubs. They're
Hmm.
open when there's no other businesses open around in the area. They're in the agricultural areas where you don't have restaurants, you don't have gas stations, you don't have anything, but you have this nice farm where you can spend time, you can eat, you can drink both alcoholic, non-alcoholic beverages. And a lot of them are the only places that are open around during the week. So they're becoming really community hubs for all walks of life, and even getting into co-working. They're offering people to work, from their brewery during the week, and stuff like that. So there's a lot of neat things happening where it's really the sense of community. And, it's kind of opposite of what happened during COVID. Now they're trying to bring people together more and saying, hey, get out of your houses and,
Hmm.
come in and come and see what we have to offer.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of like the agritourism side of things, and you mentioned, right, just you touched on it a little bit earlier about the different farm winery license categories. I know that there's been some updates on that. Do you mind just giving us like a quick overview of what has changed? I think there's a new license type that actually really doesn't require on-site growing these days. Can you just talk a little bit about what that looks like these days?
Yeah, I have to double check. I know there's a class one, two, three, and
Yeah.
four farm winery license. I believe the class one requires you to produce all of your wine or cider from what you grow on site. You can't
Hmm.
contract from anywhere. You also can't buy from a wholesaler like other farm wineries can. I believe the class two is like, I think, a 3 acre minimum. with 51% of production have to come from your land and also land you own. The class 3, I believe, is what what they're trying to push as the contract model. So you don't have to grow anything to be a farm winery class 3. Or I shouldn't say you grow anything. You could grow, you grow something. You can have, one apple tree, one, but you have a minimum. I think it's like 5,000 liters a year. And the idea is you're producing custom crushing and stuff for other farm wineries as well. That allows you, though, to have a tasting, but you have to have a decent size operation. This is not just, hey, we throw up a little, bottle in the corner and call ourselves a winery. You have a minimum production of, I think, at least 5,000 liters a year. Then you get those other benefits of remote privileges, tasting room. You can buy from wholesalers, but there's all these new licenses have a lot more caveats than they used to have before July 1, 2023. So I know the ABC website has a lot of good information of what the differences are of all the new 4 types of farm wineries. But yeah, they're very different than they were.
Yeah, and it's a new reality that people are coming into, and models are going to shift. And I think, especially for folks that are looking to set up now, revisiting that model, if you've been working on it for a couple of years, making sure that what you were intending to do still applies. And we don't even have to touch the issue of beer self-distribution now that that's something that breweries are thinking about a bunch. That's probably merits its own discussion here. But I did want to answer a question that came in from one of our attendees. So he says, just to clarify, a licensed brewery operating under contract brewing arrangements and fulfills the 20% on-site production or packaging requirements can lawfully sell or serve the contract brewery beer under the contract brewery brand label, but will be responsible for paying the higher non-discounted tax rate for that beer. The discounted tax rate is only applied if the contract brewer kegs packages it under the purchasing brand label. Is that correct?
That's a great question. I believe if you look at the code, it has to be your brand. So if you're just a licensed brewery, you cannot sell anyone else's brand for on-site consumption. So basically, when you're brewing, I know a lot of breweries, they're basically white labeling. They're just offering what they already produce on site, for their clients. Then breweries are buying it under a contract brewing agreement, but they're changing the name and changing the brand. So I believe that is one of the requirements, is it has to be your own brand that they're brewing. Nothing says it has to be your own formulation. It just has to be your brand. So, and it depends on how it's transferred. What I've seen is almost all brewery to brewery transfers are not done as a transfer at the federal level. It is the producing breweries, what I've seen, been paying the excise tax and then transferring it over, and it's the state excise tax that the receiving brewery ultimately ends up paying when they sell it. But there's nuances and caveats to all of that as well. So it's not just a one size fits all example of what is going on. But yeah, if you're going to transfer, kegged beer in bond at the federal level, that now you don't qualify for the reduced tax rate because you didn't produce it. Other factors come into play, whereas if you have a big brand and you sell a lot, you could end up being in a different tax category because your barrelage is so high, and you can't go then back under to try to get under that tax rate by then trying to go to all these other breweries and getting them to contract brew your beer. Because then that same brand still might be required to pay a higher level tax because it's also by the brand and not necessarily who's produced it. So it can get very complicated, especially for these larger breweries who might be hitting that, 60,000 barrel or these certain thresholds of payments, $50,000 a year or other things.
Yeah, that is interesting. I know there's so many nuances here. It's hard to address all the situations, but
Exactly.
appreciate you laying it out a little bit here. Well, we're nearing the end of our hour, so I'll just, wrap up with one kind of broad question for you here, Kevin. So obviously we don't know the way that the industry is going to grow. I think the past couple of years shows that all prognostication is kind of not worth its time, but we do know that there's going to be evolution here. Do you have any kind of advice for people that are interested in operating at the vanguard of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, the industry, when people are saying like beer sales specifically are lower, you're going down, that's really distribution in a way. It's not showing what's happening at your local brewery on the weekends, because that's where our breweries and our wineries and our distilleries make their money. They're making it in-house in their tasting room and not through distribution. So, I mean, really, it's staying true to locals. It's being local. It's advertising. It's staying within your community and getting people to come to you, because it's getting harder and harder to push these brands across the nation. Because when you go to a grocery store, there's not room, for everyone's product. So it's getting crowded in a way when it comes to distribution, but not as much when you think of a new brewery coming in. Everyone's like, oh, a new brewery, yet they're packed, and there's hundreds and sometimes thousands of people that still go on the weekends. So there is, I think as of this morning, I think there's 31 pending brewery applications with Virginia ABC and 15 pending limited brewery or farm brewery applications. You got 46 pending breweries coming into Virginia, and just a handful here and there are closing. And usually the ones that are closing are in the commercial districts. They're in the strip malls, because it's a lot harder to draw people. That people are working from home. They're not going to happy hour. They're staying in, but they're the weekend warriors, really, when it comes down to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a whole additional conversation about, right, the regulations for on-site service. It's a really important area for people to make sure they're speaking to today. But for now, really appreciate your time, Kevin, in kind of talking through these areas, especially ones that are, maybe not all that clear these days. So appreciate you sharing your expertise, and thank you all for tuning in today. Cheers, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I would also like to thank everyone. Kevin, thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank everyone who attended today. And as a reminder, you will receive an email with a link to the recording. If you would like to sign up for upcoming webinars or access recorded webinars, please visit virginiasbdc.org/training. These resources are designed to be used in collaboration with your local SBDC advisors. You can sign up for a free and confidential session by emailing help@virginiasbdc.org or via our website. And we do hope to see everyone at our next session. Take care, everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye.